The universe had one rule: don't anger humanity. The galaxy ignored it. Part 2. The Memory of Earth. Carol Dunn did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. In 30 years of politics, across 4 terms in the Human Assembly and 2 on the Soul Defense Committee, she had built a reputation not on speeches, but on silences. She was 60 years old, short, with silver hair cut close to her head, and eyes that made people feel like she was reading them the way other people read documents, carefully, completely, without missing anything. She called the closed session on a Tuesday morning. No press, no cameras, no visitors. Just the 61 members of the Soul Defense Committee in a room with no windows, and on the table in front of Carol's seat, a single sheet of paper. She stood up and she read the names. All 46 of them, first name, last name, age. She read them slowly, without rushing. Some of the committee members shifted in their seats. Some looked at the table. One, a younger man named Carl Briggs, who had been on the committee for less than a year, pressed his hand flat against the table, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. When she finished reading, she set the paper down. Then she asked, "What do we do when the law does not protect us?" Nobody answered right away. That was fine. Carol had not asked the question because she needed an answer. She had asked it because she wanted every person in that room to sit with it, to feel its weight, to understand that the question was not a political one. It was a human one, as old as any war, as old as any village that had ever watched its people taken and turned to a council of strangers for help and been told to wait. 3 hours later, the committee voted to authorize Directive 7. It was not announced. There was no press release. Directive 7 was a quiet thing, a deep breath kind of thing. It meant that certain assets were being moved. Certain ships that were listed as reserve vessels were being pulled out and upgraded. Certain officers who had been retired were being called and asked if they were still interested in serving. The language of the directive was careful and dry, the kind of language that was designed to be boring if anyone outside happened to read it. But anyone who knew what to look for could see exactly what it was. Carol signed it at the bottom without ceremony and handed it to her aide. Then she poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the gray earth sky and thought about a pilot named Greg Sato, who had flown supply runs for 12 years. Lou Garrett got the call on a Wednesday evening. He was in his garden, which he had been working on for 2 years, and which still looked, in his own words, like something had gone wrong. He was 63, with a face like old leather, and hands that never quite seemed to stay still. He had retired from the human fleet 18 months ago, at the strong suggestion of several people who were tired of him saying things that made command meetings uncomfortable. He had been a good admiral. He was also the kind of man who did not know how to be anything else. When the call came, he listened without speaking. When it was finished, he said, "Give me 48 hours. Then he went inside, told his wife, who looked at him for a long moment, and then said, "I knew it," and started packing. On Vega 9, Nina was doing what she always did when things got quiet and tense. She walked. The station had levels that most conclave diplomats never visited. The lower rings were home to species that served the elder races, species that ran maintenance and carried supplies and cleaned the corridors that the council members walked through without ever looking down. Nina had spent months in those corridors. She knew the names of engineers and cargo handlers and medics from 7 different worlds. She brought them food sometimes, or small things she thought they might like. In return, they talked to her. It was an old Solani archivist named Vess who told her about the records. Vess was small, gray and old in the way that very old things are old, quietly and without apology. He worked in the station's lower archive room, which almost no one visited because almost everything in it had been catalogued and filed and forgotten. He had found Nina interesting from the first time she came down to ask about Solani biology and had stayed to listen to him talk for 3 hours. He told her about the Urath, in a voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it. The Urath had been a species from the outer arm of the galaxy, aggressive and fast-growing, 800 years ago. They had spread quickly, claimed territory without asking, and when they destroyed a Solani colony, not a military base, a colony, families and children and everything, the Conclave had not convened a session. The Solani had not filed a complaint, they had simply acted. 11 days, Vess said quietly. The Urath were gone in 11 days. Nina looked at him, and the Conclave approved that? Vess made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. The Conclave did not object. The elder species understood. When you destroy someone's family, you do not get a council review. You get a consequence. Nina sat with that for a long time. Then she asked Vess if she could access the archive records. He said yes. She spent the next 6 hours reading. She sent the files to Dale with one line attached. They understand force. They always have. They just never thought we had any. Dale read the files in the early morning, when the station was as quiet as it ever got. He read about the Urath. He read about what the Solani had done and why, and how the galaxy had simply moved on afterward, the way a river moves on after a stone has been removed. He read about 8 other cases across 800 years, smaller incidents, different species, different crimes, and in every single one the pattern was the same. The Conclave talked. The elder species acted. The action was decisive and total, and was never, not once, called a misunderstanding. He thought about the Langley. He thought about 40 minutes and compensation credits. He closed the files. He looked at the viewport. Then he opened a secure channel and made one call. Back in the Sol system, Lou Garrett was standing on the bridge of the UES Franklin for the first time in 18 months. The ship was being upgraded in a dry dock above Mars, and the sound of work was everywhere. Cutting tools and pressure seals, and the deep hum of new systems coming online. Technology that the Conclave did not know humanity had been developing. Drive systems that were faster than anything registered in Conclave databases. Weapons that had never been listed on any disclosure form because they had not existed when the last disclosure form was filed. Humanity had been quiet about what it was learning. It had been polite, it had followed the rules, but it had also been watching and thinking and building, the way humans always build, with their heads down and their hands busy, for the day when building might matter. Garrett walked the length of the bridge and said nothing. His chief engineer, a young woman named Paula Vance, followed behind him with a datapad and gave him numbers. When she was done, he said, "When can we move?" 3 weeks, she said. 2, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. She said, 2 weeks. He nodded and walked off the bridge to find coffee. Somewhere behind him, the Franklin hummed with new power, and 17 other ships in dry docks across the solar system hummed with it. Nobody announced anything. Nobody made threats. No speeches were given. No flags were waved. Humanity simply began, in the quiet and careful way it did most things that mattered, to get ready. The universe had one rule. Don't anger humanity. The galaxy ignored it. Part 3. The lesson begins. Vorn Kaz had commanded Kaeldor warships for 40 years. He was large, even by Kaeldor standards, with a wide chest and a slow way of moving that made him look calm in situations that made lesser commanders afraid. He had fought in 3 border conflicts and won all of them. He was not a reckless creature. He was simply confident, because his entire life had given him every reason to be. When his long-range sensors picked up 17 human ships moving toward the edge of Kaeldor space, he looked at the readings for a moment, then turned to his bridge officer and said, "How many did you say?" 17, the officer said. Vorn Kaz looked at the readings again. Then he looked at his own fleet numbers. He had 280 warships in the sector. He had faced enemies with 3 times that number, and won. He sent a single message to the lead human vessel, which his systems identified as the UES Franklin. Remove your vessels from this region immediately, or they will be removed for you. He waited. He expected either silence or a retreat. What he got was 4 words. Come and try it. He stared at the message for a long time. Then he ordered his forward ships to move. Lou Garrett was drinking bad coffee on the bridge of the Franklin when the Kaeldor fleet began to advance. Paul Vance was at the weapons station. Lieutenant Ray Okafor was commanding his destroyer, the UES Holt, at the left edge of the human formation. Ray was 26 years old, which was young for a ship commander. But nobody who had served with him found that fact particularly important after the first day. He was fast, and he was steady, and he thought about 3 things at once, without appearing to think about anything at all. Garrett set his coffee cup down and looked at his display. The Kaeldor ships were moving in a wide formation. Standard doctrine for a species that liked to overwhelm by sheer presence. They were expecting the human ships to break and run. Every species they had ever faced had broken and run. Garrett said, "All ships, go." What followed was not what Vorn Kaz expected. He had expected humans to fight the way every lesser species fought, forming up, trading fire, trying to hold a line. He had expected something organized and readable, something he could counter. What he got was something that looked almost like chaos, except that it worked perfectly. The human ships split immediately into groups of 3 and 4. They did not hold a line. They moved constantly, fast and unpredictable, cutting across each other's paths, pulling Kaeldor ships out of formation and isolating them, then hitting those isolated ships from 2 or 3 directions at once before moving on. The moment a human ship took damage, another one came in to cover it. The moment a Kaeldor ship showed a weak point, 2 or 3 human ships were already moving toward it. Vorn Kaz kept issuing orders, and kept watching his orders become wrong by the time they reached his captains. The humans were not fighting a battle. They were fighting 10 battles at the same time, and they were treating each one differently. Ray Okafor was watching his display when he saw the opening. The Franklin was pinned between 3 Kaeldor cruisers, taking hits from 2 sides. His ship, the Holt, was small and fast, and not designed for a direct fight with a cruiser. But the gap between those 3 cruisers was exactly wide enough. He told his crew to hold on. Then he took the Holt into the gap at full speed. It was not a precise or elegant maneuver. The Holt, port side, caught the edge of one cruiser's weapons array, and the entire left section of his ship lost power in under a second. Warning lights filled the bridge. Someone behind him said something he did not quite hear. He kept flying. He threaded the Holt through the gap, and came out on the other side with enough distance. And the 3 cruisers, which had been focused on the Franklin, turned to deal with this new problem behind them. That was all Garrett needed. The Franklin fired a full salvo into the exposed rear sections of all 3 cruisers, and then was already moving before the debris cleared. Ray pulled the Holt into a slow curve and let his crew start assessing damage. His port side was gone. Not badly damaged, gone. He looked at the readout for a moment. Then he said, "What do we still have?" "Starboard weapons, engines, life support," his systems officer said. "Good enough," Ray said. When the engagement was over, 19 Kaeldor ships had been destroyed. Humanity had lost 4. Vorn Kaz pulled his fleet back to a safe distance and sent no further messages for 6 hours. On Vega 9, the battle footage arrived in the Conclave's intelligence feeds in real time. The chamber was not in session, but most of the ambassadors watched from their quarters or offices. Thessarid watched the footage 3 times. He did not speak while he watched. His aide stood behind him, and also said nothing. On the 3rd viewing, Thessarid paused the footage at the moment the Holt went into the gap between the 3 cruisers. A small ship, damaged, still flying. He looked at that image for a long time. Then he said, in Vreth, something that translated roughly as, "We have made a very serious error in judgment." His aide said, "What do we do?" Fesserid was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We think." Garrett stood on the Franklin's bridge and looked at the damage reports from his 4 lost ships. He read the names of the crews. He did not look away while he read them. When he was finished, he handed the list to Paula and told her to make sure the names were sent to Earth before anything else. Then, he sent a message to the Kaeldor fleet. It said, "This was a demonstration. The next one will not be." He got no response. He had not expected one. He poured himself more coffee and told his crew to begin repairs. Ray Okafor was sitting in the Holt's small medical bay, getting his arm looked at, a bad burn from a conduit that had blown during the maneuver, when his comm unit lit up. Ray answered it with one hand because the other one was being wrapped. Garrett said, "That was a good piece of flying, Lieutenant." Ray said, "Thank you, sir." Garrett said, "Your port side is gone." "Yes, sir." "Can you fly?" Ray thought about it. "Yes, sir." "Good," Garrett said, and ended the call. Ray looked at the medic wrapping his arm. The medic looked back at him. Ray said, "Finish fast." Back in the conclave chamber, Dale Hooper walked in without announcing himself. He had not been invited. There was no session scheduled. The room was being used by a group of junior Solani administrators, who looked up in surprise when he entered. He did not acknowledge them. He walked to the human seat, the small one, slightly to the left of center, and sat down. Then he placed a document on the table. It was printed on paper, like the list of names Nina had given him. It listed every human colony that had been displaced, taxed illegally, harassed, or denied rights in the Orion Fringe over the last 40 years. There were a lot of entries. The list was long enough that it had to be folded to fit on the table. He sat back and waited. He did not say anything. He did not call anyone. He just sat in his seat with his hands folded and the list on the table and waited for the people who ran things to come find him. It did not take long. The universe had one rule: don't anger humanity. The galaxy ignored it. Part 4. When Humanity Remembers Who It Is. The first offer came within 12 hours. A conclave representative, not Fesserid, but a younger Vreth named Solov, who had been assigned the job of making difficult things less difficult, arrived at Dale's quarters with a prepared document. It outlined a reparations package. The numbers were significant. It also included language about expanded territorial recognition for human colonies in the outer sectors, though the wording was vague enough to mean almost anything, depending on who was reading it. Dale read the whole document. Then he set it on the table beside his untouched breakfast, and said, "Who wrote this?" Solov said the council had prepared it jointly. Dale said, "Ask them to try again." Solov looked uncertain. "Captain Hooper, the offer is substantial. The council believes it represents on Part 10. "I know what the council believes," Dale said, not unkindly, just plainly. "And I know what 46 people who are not here anymore would think of compensation credits. Ask them to try again." Solov left. Dale finished his breakfast. The second offer came the next morning and was slightly better. Dale read it and said the same thing. Solov began to look like a man who was running out of approaches. On the third day, Fesserid himself came. This was, as Nina had once explained to Dale, a significant thing. Vreth elders did not visit other people's quarters. They received visitors. The fact that Fesserid was standing in Dale's doorway rather than sending another message meant that something in the old ambassador's thinking had shifted, even if only slightly. Real Earth coffee, brewed in a small machine he had brought from home, and defended against 3 different attempts by station maintenance to remove it for regulation violations. Fesserid looked at the cup for a moment, then accepted it. He sat down, carefully, because Vreth joints did not bend the same way human ones did, and wrapped his upper hands around the cup. He said, "You are not an easy man to negotiate with." Dale said, "No. You have rejected 2 offers that most species in the conclave would have accepted." "Yes." Fesserid looked at him. "What is it that you actually want, Captain?" Dale thought about that for a moment, not because he did not know the answer. He had known the answer for a long time. He thought about it because he wanted to say it right. Then he said, "I want the 46 names on that list to mean something. I want the Kaldor to say out loud in the official record that what they did was not a misunderstanding. I want every human colony in the Orion Fringe to be recognized under full conclave law. And I want a tribunal with human representation equal to any other species on it to investigate what happened and make sure it cannot happen again." Fesserid was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup. "Those are significant demands." "They are basic ones," Dale said. "They are the things you would have given any elder species in the same situation without being asked." Fesserid did not disagree. That was, Dale thought, the most honest moment they had ever had. Carol Dunn arrived at Vega 9 on the 5th day. She had not been invited by the conclave. She had simply come on a regular transport without ceremony or announcement. When she walked into the station, she looked exactly like what she was. A small silver-haired woman in a plain suit, carrying a single bag. And the conclave staff who saw her did not immediately understand that she was perhaps the most dangerous person who had walked through those doors in years. She met with Dale and Nina the night before the formal session. They sat in Dale's quarters with coffee and a map of the Orion Fringe spread across the table. Carol listened more than she spoke. She asked a few questions, sharp, specific, the kind of questions that told you the person asking had already read everything there was to read and just wanted to confirm the parts that mattered most. When she was satisfied, she said, "Good. Tomorrow we finish this." The conclave chamber was full the next morning. Word had spread, as it always did, on a station like Vega 9, that something significant was happening. Ambassadors who normally sent junior staff to sessions were present themselves. Even a few Kaldor representatives sat in their section, though they did not look comfortable. Carol stood at the human position and did not use notes. She spoke for 11 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She told the council that humanity was not interested in conquest. They were not seeking revenge. They were not trying to embarrass anyone or restructure the conclave or claim territory they were not entitled to. They were interested in something much simpler and much harder to manufacture than any of those things. They were interested in being treated like people, like a species whose children mattered, like a civilization whose dead deserved more than 40 minutes and a credit transfer. Then she laid out the 3 conditions, exactly as Dale had told Fesserid, but slower, and with the 46 names read again into the official record. The chamber was completely silent while she did. When she finished, she said, "The galaxy has a rule. We all know it, even if no one writes it down. The rule is know who you are dealing with. We are asking the council to know who you are dealing with." Then she sat down and waited. The council deliberated for 6 days. There were private meetings and messages, and at least 2 attempts to renegotiate the conditions into something softer. Carol said no each time, briefly and without anger. Dale said no the same way. Garrett's fleet remained at the edge of Kaldor space, not moving, not threatening, just existing, which was its own kind of message. On the 7th day, the council agreed to all 3 conditions. The Kaldor acknowledgement was read into the official record by their senior representative in a voice that was very flat and very careful. He said that the destruction of the civilian vessel Langley had not been a navigational misunderstanding, and that the Kaldor Empire accepted full responsibility. He did not add anything to that. He did not have to. In the lower corridors of Vega 9, Nina was walking back from the archive room when she saw Vess standing near a water station, watching a small screen where the session was still being broadcast. The old Solani archivist looked at her when she approached. "Is it done?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, my people have a saying. It translates roughly as, a sleeping thing when woken is twice what it was before." Nina looked at him. "Is that about us?" He made the small sound that was not quite a laugh. "It is about everyone. But yes, today it is about you." Ray Okafor stood on the deck of his rebuilt ship 3 weeks after the engagement, and watched his crew running checks on the new port section. His arm was out of the brace. Garrett had come aboard that morning to hand him a new commission, a promotion 2 ranks above his current one, which Ray had argued about for 10 minutes before accepting. Garrett had shaken his hand at the end of the argument, and said nothing. From Garrett, that meant everything. Ray stood at the viewport, and looked at the Orion fringe, which was the same as it had always been. Open space, quiet, with a few colony ships moving through it on their regular routes, unhurried, unchallenged. He thought about the 46 names. He thought about the Holt's port side going dark. He thought about the question his systems officer had asked him during the fight, whether they should fall back, and the answer he had given, which was no. Not yet, not while the Franklins still needed them. He thought, this is what it means to be human. Not the winning, the not leaving. The universe had one rule. Don't anger humanity. The galaxy ignored it. Part 5. The rule the galaxy forgot. 6 months after the Battle of the Orion Fringe, the galaxy had not changed in any way you could point to on a map. The stars were the same. The trade routes were the same. The conclave still met on Vega 9, and the council chambers still had 62 seats, arranged in the same wide arc they had always been arranged in. If you looked at any of it from the outside, nothing seemed different. But everything was different. In the way that things are different after something has been said out loud that everyone knew but no one had spoken. The air in a room changes after that. Not the temperature, not the light, just the air. The Kaldor Empire had withdrawn all ships from the Orion Fringe within 30 days of the agreement. They had done it quietly, without announcement, the way large things move when they do not want anyone to notice how much ground they are giving up. Human colony ships now cross the fringe on their regular routes without deviation. No dark shapes appeared on their sensors. No proximity incidents occurred. The space that had belonged to everyone and been treated as belonging to the Kaldor was simply open again, the way it was always supposed to be. 3 smaller species, the Solani, the Tev, and a quiet people called the Mirren, who had 3 seats on the outer ring of the conclave and almost never spoke in full sessions, had begun opening channels directly to humanity. Not through the conclave, not through formal procedures. Direct channels, the kind used between equals. They had not asked the elder races for permission to do this. That too was new. The Solani sent a cultural exchange delegation to Earth. It was small. 5 people. But they came with gifts and stayed for 2 months, and were taken to see things that humanity was proud of. Old cities, and mountains, and oceans, and a small museum in a place called Lisbon that was full of objects from ships that had sailed on water centuries ago, when water was the only ocean anyone had. The head of the delegation was Vess's younger colleague, a quiet woman named Sel, who had never left her home system before. She stood in front of a case containing a compass, a tool for finding direction, for a very long time. When asked what she was thinking, she said, "We do not have a word in our language for a tool that tells you where you are. We have always known where we are. I think perhaps we have been missing something." Nina wrote about that moment in the final chapter of her research on the Urath. She had been writing and rewriting the chapter for months. The earlier chapters were about history. The Urath, the Solani response, the pattern of force and consequence, that ran through conclave history like a river through stone. But the final chapter was about humanity, and it was the hardest to write because she did not want it to be wrong. She sat in the archive room on Vega 9, with Vess across the table from her, drinking tea he had made in a small pot he kept for visitors. And she told him what she was trying to say, and why she was having trouble saying it. Vess listened. When she finished, he said, "You are trying to say that your people are not the greatest in the galaxy, but they are perhaps the most difficult to finish." She looked at him. "Yes, but I do not want it to sound like bragging." He made his small sound, "Then say it the way you said it just now, plainly." She went back to her quarters that evening and wrote the chapter in 3 hours. She did not use large words. She wrote that humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy, or the oldest, or the most advanced in any single field anyone could measure. She wrote that humanity was stubborn in a way that was hard to explain unless you had watched it up close. Stubborn not in the way of a creature that refuses to move, but in the way of a creature that keeps moving when everything says it should stop. She wrote that stubbornness, when it belongs to a species that has already survived everything its own world could do to it for 10,000 years, becomes something else. It becomes a kind of gravity. Quiet, constant, impossible to argue with. She submitted the paper to 3 different journals on the same day, and went to bed early for the first time in months. Dale Hooper was appointed humanity's first full ambassador to the Galactic Conclave in a small ceremony on Earth that he attended by video link because he was already back on Vega 9. Carol Dunn gave a short speech at the ceremony about service and patience, which was about Dale without mentioning his name, the way good speeches often work. His mother watched from the front row and cried, which he heard about later from his sister, and pretended not to be moved by, which he was. He moved into the ambassador's office on Vega 9, which was slightly larger than his old quarters and had a better viewport. He brought his coffee machine and set it on the desk where everyone who visited would see it. Nobody said anything about regulation violations this time. He kept the list of 46 names in his jacket pocket. He had a new jacket now, the formal one that came with the ambassador title, and the first thing he did was move the folded piece of paper to the inside pocket of the new one. It was worn at the fold lines now, soft from being handled. He was not sure when he had started thinking of it as something he needed to carry. He just knew that he did. The first thing he did in his new official capacity was file a motion to have the Orion Fringe formally reclassified in all conclave records from contested territory to open territory, which it had always been supposed to be. The motion passed in 4 minutes, which was the fastest anything had ever passed in that chamber in living memory. Garrett took his fleet back to the Sol system in the 8th month and began the process of standing down from active deployment. He shook hands with each of his captains before their ships departed. He did not say much to any of them. He told Paula Vance she had done good work with the Franklin's upgrades. He told Ray Okafor that the Holt had been reassigned to border patrol in the Fringe, and asked if he wanted it. Ray said yes, before Garrett finished the sentence. "Good," he said, and walked to his transport without looking back, which was how Garrett ended most conversations that had gone the way he wanted them to. The evening before his message to the Vreth Council had to be sent, 3 weeks overdue. Thessarid sat alone in his office and looked at the blank document on his screen for a long time. He had lived for 280 years. He had served the Conclave for over a century. He had watched species rise and fall and rise again, had seen alliances form and break apart, had navigated more political crises than most people lived long enough to witness. He believed, as most Vreth elders believed, that he understood how things worked. Not perfectly, but well. He had been wrong about humanity. He had looked at them, small, emotional, relatively new, prone to talking about their dead and their history, and something they called home as if place were a living thing. And he had decided that he understood them. He had fit them into a category he already had, and he had moved on to the next concern. That was the mistake, not the dismissal itself, though that had been wrong. The deeper mistake was the certainty, the assumption that a species could be understood from the outside without ever really looking. He began to write. He wrote that humanity was not the species he had thought they were. He wrote that he had confused politeness with weakness, which was a mistake that he suspected others in the conclave had made as well, and would have to examine for themselves. He wrote that humanity had qualities that the elder species had spent so many centuries valuing: power, age, and technology, that they had forgotten to value: the willingness to lose something and still keep going, the refusal to treat their dead as a closed matter, the ability to be afraid and act anyway. He wrote, "There is an old rule in this galaxy, unwritten, known to every species that has survived long enough to understand it. The rule is simple. Know who you are dealing with before you act." We did not know. We assumed. An assumption expires the moment the other side decides they have had enough. He sent it. Then he looked at his desk and saw the cup Dale had given him months ago, still sitting where he had placed it after that first meeting. He picked it up. It was cold now. He had never tried to refill it, not knowing how the machine worked or whether it was appropriate to ask. He walked to Dale's office. The door was open. Dale was reading something at his desk and looked up when Fesserid appeared in the doorway. Fesserid held out the cup. "I would like to know how this works," he said. Dale looked at the cup for a moment. Then he stood up and went to the coffee machine. "Sit down," he said. "It is not complicated." Fesserid sat. Outside the viewport, in the open space of the Orion Fringe, a human cargo ship crossed in a straight line, unhurried. No ships appeared on its sensors. No message came ordering it to change course. It simply flew, the way ships are supposed to fly, through space that belonged to everyone. It was the most ordinary thing in the galaxy. Fesserid watched it through the viewport while Dale made coffee, and did not say anything. He did not have words for what he was thinking. He was thinking that he had spent 280 years learning how the galaxy worked, and that he might need to start again from somewhere closer to the beginning. He was thinking that the small species with the emotional attachments and the dead they would not stop carrying had shown him something he had not expected to see in this century or any other. He was thinking that perhaps the rule nobody had bothered to write down was not really about force at all. It was about this: some things cannot be ended simply because someone powerful decides they should end. Some things keep going. Some people keep flying. And a galaxy that forgets that eventually learns it. The coffee was ready. Dale set a cup in front of him. Fesserid picked it up with both hands and drank. Outside, the cargo ship disappeared into the dark, heading home. The universe had one rule: don't anger humanity. The galaxy ignored it. Part 1. The warning nobody gave. The station smelled like something between metal and old rain. That was how Dale Hooper always described it when people back home asked him what it was like to live on Conclave Station Vega 9. Metal and old rain. Not unpleasant, just alien, just not Earth. Dale was a tall man, 41 years old, with short brown hair, and hands that looked like they had fixed more engines than they had shaken in greeting. He had a quiet face. Not cold, just quiet. The kind of face that did not give much away unless it chose to. He had been the human liaison officer on Vega 9 for 3 years, and in that time he had sat through more council sessions than he could count. He had filed more complaints than he could count. And he had watched more of those complaints disappear into nothing than he liked to think about. He was sitting in the small human section of the station's main hall when Nina Cortez found him. She was carrying 2 cups of something warm and handed him one without asking. Nina was 36, with dark eyes and the kind of energy that made people feel like the room had gotten a little brighter. She was a xenobiologist by training, but on Vega 9, she spent most of her time talking to aliens in the lower corridors and writing reports that most of the conclave never read. Fesserid pushed the Orion complaint back again, she said, sitting down across from him. Dale looked at his cup. I know. That's the 3rd time. I know that too. Nina looked at him for a moment. She had worked with Dale long enough to understand his silences. This one was not defeat. It was something else. Something slower and heavier. The Orion Fringe had been open territory for over a century. Every species in the conclave was allowed to move through it, settle it, trade in it. That was the agreement. But in the last 2 years, Kaeldor warships had been appearing near human colony vessels with increasing frequency. They did not fire. They just sat there, large and dark and deliberate, until the human ships changed course. A few colony transports had been turned back entirely. One had suffered damage to its navigation array, in what the Kaeldor called an accidental proximity incident. Nobody believed that. Humanity had filed 4 formal complaints with the Galactic Conclave. The Conclave had reviewed 2 of them. Both reviews lasted less than 15 minutes. The Kaeldor were one of the oldest and largest powers in the Conclave. They had 17 seats on the main council. The math was not complicated. The council session that afternoon was supposed to be about trade routes. Dale sat in the human seat, which was smaller than the others, and placed slightly to the left of center. Close enough to participate, but far enough to remind everyone who mattered and who did not. He had stopped being bothered by that a long time ago. Or he had learned to behave like he had. Fesserid spoke for most of the session. He was the Vreth ambassador, old by any measure, with a voice like gravel turning slowly. The Vreth were tall and thin, and had 4 arms, and the kind of patience that came from living for 300 years. Fesserid was not a cruel creature. Dale had decided that early on. He was simply certain. Certain of the order of things, certain of who mattered and who was still learning. That certainty was its own kind of cruelty, Dale thought, even if it did not know it was. When Dale raised the Orion issue again, Fesserid did not sigh. He did not roll his eyes. He simply looked at Dale the way a teacher looks at a student who has asked the same question too many times. And he said, in perfect translated English, Captain Hooper, the Council has noted humanity's concerns. We ask that your people learn the patience of civilized species while proper review is conducted. The room did not laugh. Nothing in the room laughed, but Dale felt the weight of every set of alien eyes on him, and he understood that most of them agreed with Fesserid and were simply too polite to show it. He wrote the date in his log and asked for a recess. Nina found him at a viewport on the station's outer ring. The stars outside were the same stars they always were, bright and indifferent. She stood beside him and did not say anything for a while. "What are you thinking?" she finally asked. He did not answer right away. He looked at one particular star that he knew was roughly in the direction of the Orion Fringe. Then he said, "I am thinking that nobody warned them." She frowned. "Warned them about what?" He looked at her. "About us." 3 days later, a Kaeldor warship intercepted the civilian freighter Langley in the Orion Fringe. The Langley was carrying food supplies to a small human colony called Newfield. It was not a military ship. It had no weapons. It carried 46 people, including 11 children, and a pilot named Greg Sato, who had been flying supply runs for 12 years without a single incident. The official Kaeldor report, filed 6 hours after the event, described it as a navigational misunderstanding. The freighter, they said, had entered a restricted zone. When asked which zone, they referenced a boundary that had not existed in any conclave map before that week. The Langley was gone. There was a debris field about 3 kilometers wide, in the middle of open space, and pieces of the ship's cargo floated among the wreckage, crates of dried grain, and sealed water containers drifting in silence in a place where nothing lived and no one was watching. The conclave convened an emergency session. It lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, the council recommended that humanity accept a payment of compensation credits equal to roughly the value of the cargo, and consider the matter closed in the interest of maintaining regional stability. Dale sat in his small seat to the left of center, and said nothing. He looked at the list of 46 names that Nina had quietly placed in front of him during the session. She had written them by hand, on paper, which she had to find in storage because almost no one on Vega 9 used paper. 46 names. Some of them had last names that told you everything about where their families had come from. Sato, Reyes, Morrison, Osei, Pham. All of them were human. All of them were gone. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. On the way out of the chamber, Thessarid passed him in the corridor. The old Vreth looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. It was hard to tell with Vreth faces, and said, "Captain, these things are painful, but they pass." Dale stopped walking. He looked at Thessarid for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, things pass." He walked back to his quarters, sat down, and opened a secure channel to Earth. He wrote one message. It was not long. It said, "They destroyed the Langley. 46 dead. Conclave closed the case in 40 minutes. I am formally requesting that someone back home start paying attention." Then he looked at the viewport, and the same and different stars, and thought about Greg Sato flying supply runs for 12 years without a single incident. 46 people who had not done anything wrong. 46 people who had simply been human in the wrong part of space at the wrong time. Nobody had warned them, he thought again. Nobody had told the Kaeldor or the Vreth or the Conclave or any of them what it meant to do something like this to a species like humanity. Nobody had explained what happened when you pushed people who had survived everything their own world had thrown at them for 10,000 years. Nobody had sat them down and said, "These are not a patient people. They are a polite people. There is a difference, and the difference matters enormously." He turned off the light and went to sleep. Outside the viewport, the stars burned quietly, and somewhere in the direction of the Orion fringe, pieces of the Langley drifted in the dark.